Hello everyone and welcome. It's May 2022 and May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So I wanted to do a little bit of a different video, a more personal video about a topic that I have some personal experience in, which is that of OCD. And I wanted to try and combine it a bit with what I normally talk about on my YouTube channel, experience creation and storytelling and interpretation. But first of all, in case you may not be aware of it, OCD stands for Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. So obsessive as in an obsession about something, compulsive very often as in repeating or a repetition of something. And disorder, which is a very important word as well, because OCD is not often described as a mental health disease, but as a disorder or a dysfunction. And I have to say, I've never actually felt like I had a disease as such, but certainly a disorder. It is certainly something that disrupts your life and your daily life. So it certainly is a disorder. Now, OCD very often comes across either as obsessive compulsive thoughts or thought patterns, or as obsessive compulsive behavior or actions, so something that you do. And very often if you experience OCD, you will have both of these. It will be a combination. Now, just to add to the confusion, some people, like with all other forms of diseases, might also have OCD in combination with other mental diseases. So for example, OCD in combination with depression or in combination with schizophrenia or something, which only adds a layer of difficulties to it because it makes it so much harder to diagnose. It is already a pretty hard thing to diagnose. Also to be aware of, and very important as well, there are different levels of OCD, just as there are different levels of anything else. Some people really have a severe form of OCD that completely cripples their lives. They are not capable of looking after a normal job or their social circle of friends and family and so on, and it's really horrible. Other people like me experience a much lighter form of OCD. In fact, I often call my OCD for OCD light, and I realize that can be offensive to some people, but what I'm trying to do is actually I'm trying to make it sound less severe than it is for my own sake. I've always been capable of looking after my job, after my friends and family and my social circle and so on, but that doesn't mean that there hasn't been certain moments in my life where OCD has taken over and been in control, and it can be very dominating. And it's very important to understand that it's not something that comes and goes. It's not like a hay fever you might have in the spring and then it disappears in the winter. It's always there. But there can be different levels of it. And as with anything in life, stress makes things a lot worse. So when you're experiencing stress, your OCD will also usually flare up. Stress has a tendency of bringing out the worst parts of us. So no surprises there really. Also, I think just to debunk that old myth of being a little bit OCD, I think some people might still use that phrase, although I think there's probably a bigger awareness around it now. But you can't be a little bit OCD. It's like being a little bit pregnant. You either have OCD or you don't. You're either pregnant or you're not. It's not something that comes and goes. There are times in your life, as I said, where it will flare up and be more dominating than other times, but it's always there. You can't turn it on and off. That's not how it works. So just because you might be someone who likes to keep things in order doesn't mean you have OCD. That's just being an orderly sort of person. That's not having obsessive compulsive disorder, but I think most people are aware of that one. Another thing I want to mention about OCD, and this is quite important for especially for when we are creating experiences and interpretation and storytelling, is that many people who have OCD have a certain number in their heads as well that they live by or adhere to. So when they repeat either a thought or a behavior, they will do it a certain number of times. My number is 4. I don't know why. I have no explanation for it. Some people who suffer from OCD know perfectly well why they adhere to a certain number. I don't really. It's just a random number, but it's always been my number 4. So ever since, I think I became aware of my OCD when I was 9 or 10 years of age. That was really when I sort of started to notice that something was wrong. But of course I didn't know what it was at the time. But that number has somehow always been with me. And this brings me to the really, really, really important point about OCD. People who have OCD are perfectly aware that having these thoughts or doing these actions, behavior, is not rational. It's not normal, it's stupid, and it's a waste of time and energy. But it doesn't stop us from doing it. And this is where the disorder comes in. This is where the obsessiveness of the repetition comes in. So when I go to check my front door and check whether or not it is locked for the 4th time, I know perfectly well that door is locked because I have already checked it 3 times, but I have to do it 4 times. And it makes no sense. And it's a waste of time and energy, as I said, but that is the nature of this kind of disorder. So with OCD also comes a huge embarrassment. I don't know about you, but I think that most people find embarrassment as being a really dominating feeling. It's an incredibly powerful feeling. And when you have OCD, you feel this over and over and over again. And that's also why you don't really talk much about your OCD, because you're embarrassed about it. You know it is irrational. You know it is stupid, but you still do it. I think it's also worth mentioning that I also have times in my life where I feel OCD has actually helped me, because it certainly made me much more self-disciplined. I rarely forget stuff. I do, of course, from time to time, we all do, but I rarely forget doing things, and I always finish things because that's sort of part of my repetitive behavior. It isn't for everyone, but there can be certain elements of it that can actually be a major help. Sounds so weird to talk about it that way, but it definitely can, because it can have an impact on your behavior as well as your thought patterns. Having said that, a lot of people also feel a lot of anxiety around OCD because you tend to create the negative thought patterns in your head, or the worst case scenarios in your head. And remember, you have to repeat these thought patterns a certain number of times in your head. And this can make it very, very difficult to get out of or to try and treat. Normally you can't really get rid of your OCD, you will have to live with it, but it is certainly possible to live with it, and it is certainly possible to go through some really, really useful treatments. So have a look at those because it is certainly worth it. Now, I also wanted to go a little bit into this thing about repeating sentences in your head, thought patterns, events, go over them again and again in your head. Also behavior, repeating behavior. That can actually be a really, really powerful thing when we talk about creating experiences, because when you have OCD, you experience the same thing over and over again. And usually you do it through the emotions that you associated with the experience. So you don't just observe the experience when you have OCD, you relive the experience. And that makes it incredibly intense. I know from myself that very often, and this has been the case throughout my entire life, when I've watched a film, read a book, been to see a play at the theatre, been to a museum, for example, to see a museum exhibition or something, I very often do it again and again. Either I read up on the experience or try to seek out more information about it, or I rewatch the film or reread certain chapters of the book. Also, if it's not been a particularly good book, that doesn't really matter, but there is an experience or an emotion that I have to relive a certain number of times. So I watch that scene over and over again, or reread this chapter over and over again. And by doing so, I relive the experience through the emotions I had when I did. And depending on what number you're living by in your OCD world, that can be a lot. It can be a lot to take in. But that also means that some researchers have actually started to use metaphors and also storytelling as a way of treating OCD or providing treatments. Very often when you go through the same thought patterns again and again, you also go through the same images in your head. Not everyone is visual, but you might also, like I do, go over the same words again and again, depending on your sort of preference. If you're visual, you will have more images, of course, in your head than words. But that means the use of metaphors and storytelling in treatment of OCD has started to sort of come in as a way of reaching or gaining an understanding of what is going on in your head. Because if I can create a thought pattern around an OCD element of my life, I can also create a thought pattern around not having that and actually dialing it down, the behavior or the thought that I might have had. And this can be an incredibly powerful thing in treatment as well. What I wanted to get to here is also that you do experience in a very intense and deep way often when you have OCD. You're not necessarily more emotionally intelligent than anybody else, but your experiences do become very intense because you experience via repetition very often. So you experience the same thing over and over again, and therefore also the same feelings over and over again. I just wanted to quickly summarize, because I'm not actually sure that everything I've been going on about makes sense, but people with OCD don't repeat everything they ever do or ever think. They repeat what they become obsessive about, and that doesn't necessarily make sense. It can be anything from a thought to a behavior, an emotion. So if they become obsessive about a specific emotion they experienced in a film, for example, they will re-watch it. They might not be able to go back to a place where they experienced something, but then they will read up on it or seek more information about it and relive the experience again. There are different levels of OCD severeness. People with OCD are perfectly aware of how irrational and stupid and meaningless their OCD thoughts and or behavior can be for them. So they are very much aware that it is not rational when they do things over and over again, but it doesn't stop them from doing it. The repetition provides a feeling of calm and also safety, but the repetition itself also becomes an obsession. So you have to do things a certain number of times before you can feel that calmness, for example. And as I said, sometimes repetition also happens according to a specific number. Most people with OCD will have like a specific number they return to, or a couple of numbers they return to. Sometimes OCD can also enhance what I would describe as useful behavior or skill, like what I said, self-discipline or thoroughness, attention to detail, but also an emotional awareness that comes simply because you go through the same emotion or the same behavior, and therefore the emotion attached to that behavior over and over and over again. Metaphors and storytelling and also emotional awareness has started to become used in treatments and also to help understand OCD more, because this is something that people with OCD experience a lot or use a lot themselves, either creating a story around their obsession or becoming incredibly emotional aware around a repetition or a feeling, emotion they return to all the time. So this is a perfect way of actually trying to understand OCD, and certainly also to come up with different treatments. In storytelling and in experience design and creation, we know that creating an emotional link to something, so an emotional link to a story or an experience or a person, perhaps a historical person we are telling a story about, can be a very, very powerful tool, because once you have created an emotional link to something, this is also when visitors or audiences start to engage and start to really become absorbed in your story or in your experience. So very often we know perfectly well when we work in this sector that creating that emotional link can be really, really powerful. And I wanted to try and use at least my OCD experiences, as I have done loads of times in my work, as a way of also trying to explaining how we can work with this intensity in experiences or when creating storytelling experiences, because I actually think there is a lot we can learn from all sorts of mental diseases, but also from these types of disorders. And in trying to understand them, I think there is a lot, especially experience industries, but also storytelling can do to reach out and to actually create more awareness and more understanding around this, but also certainly use it in their experiences and in their creation of experiences. Some of the things I wanted to focus on around intensity or creating an intense emotional link in storytelling is when you go through your experience or your story, where are the intense or profound moments in your story? Because of course there will be climaxes, there will be like peaks of the story, but how do they come across? How can you dial them up and down and work with that in your storytelling? Now, why are these moments intense or emotionally strong? There will be a reason for it. Maybe this is where all the action happens, or maybe this is where someone dies, or something happens that changes the course of the story or the emotion of the story or the entire plot of the story somehow. So why are these moments intense or emotionally strong? And work with that in your storytelling or your experience as well. And then of course, how do you present them? How do you display them, communicate them, tell them? How are they designed in your experience? And then a very important one, how can visitors react to them? Now, is there an option to respond, to engage, to interact? Is it visitors who are actually, or your audiences who are actually making this particular moment in the experience happen? And remember that when you are dealing with people who have OCD, if they are emotionally engaged, they will react. We have to respond when we become emotionally engaged. Also have a think about how your stories or your experiences, if you like, can continue after the experience or after the event. So how can you provide opportunities for visitors to find out more, to experience more, maybe online, to continue the storytelling, perhaps on a different platform? How can you put focus on your story or your experience in a different way, maybe outside the physical experience room or space where you created the experience? I actually find there is a lot to be learned from experiencing intensely or for having sort of an emotional intensity in your life. And I know that OCD is certainly a way of experiencing in a very intense way. Certainly not always for good. In fact, it is most of the time something that is holding you back or is a more or less severe barrier in your life. For some people it can be absolutely horrible and really, really completely destroy their lives. For others, and I have to say the lucky ones, we might not experience it so badly, but it will certainly have been a baggage that you have to deal with and find a way of dealing with in your life. I would like to just end with one thought. I think maybe this was the entire reason for me putting this video together. If you are experiencing any of this, I know a lot of people will give the advice of reaching out, which can be very important, but you might not feel like reaching out because you might be very embarrassing that you are experiencing this or any of these symptoms. I just wanted to say that every single person in the world who's ever experienced OCD will know about this embarrassment. we are incredibly good at hiding it, hiding the fact that we have OCD. We have a lifetime of experience in doing that, either thoughts or behaviors that we repeat and that we do. And I don't think ever, I'm not ever going to not feel embarrassed about having this. I will always feel embarrassed every single time I repeat an action or a thought. And that's just the thing. It won't ever go away. But what I will say is, if you don't feel like reaching out to someone, whether it be someone you're close to, a friend, a relative, a doctor, reach out in a different way. Read up and enlighten yourself about this, because the more you get to understand about OCD and other disorders, the more you will also experience that your fear will lessen around this. You will get to know more about why you feel embarrassed. You will also experience that there are loads of people out there who will have experienced OCD in the same way you do. As I said, there are so many levels of where you can experience OCD, and in combination with many other things. And there will, I guarantee, be people who have experienced what you have experienced. Also, do have a look at some OCD societies' websites. They are really good at providing support and information, articles and so on. I guarantee there will be an OCD association or society or organization wherever you are. I use the Danish one quite a lot as I'm from Denmark, but I also sometimes check in on the UK side, and they're really good, both of them. So do have a look at that. And as you get more and more knowledge and more understanding around OCD, it becomes less severe, simply because you are enlightening yourself. It won't go away, but you will gain a much bigger understanding around it. I actually wish that I could end this video by saying don't be ashamed. There is no shame, because there isn't any shame. But when you do have this, a huge part of it is feeling constantly embarrassed about the fact that you repeat stuff and that you do things over and over again. And that is part of a dysfunction and a disorder. And it's not something that will go away, but it is something that becomes a lot easier to live with when you start to reach out, and when you start to realize that there are so many people out there experiencing this. All the best to you. Thank you for listening. How do I explain this? I want to find the right way. Oh, I lost it now. I really want to make sure this comes across in the right way. I'm gonna start again. Why is this so hard suddenly? Just because there's a camera in front of me. I think the thing is, I don't really want to contribute to more misunderstandings around OCD, because there's so many already. Okay, I'm just going to start again, and I'm just going to start again, and then I'm going to just do this video, okay? The really ironic thing about this is that I now have to reshoot this video 4 times. That's ironic.